We're now joined by Professor Robert Hazell, who's Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London. Good evening to you, Professor Hazell.
Good evening.
Can I just get your reflections on, I suppose, the constitutional dimension of this story? I don't wish to seem in any way cold, or so soon after the news of the King suffering from cancer, but there'll be a great deal of interest in all of this, and we know something, don't we, of the arrangements for the royal household to cope at this time, to fill some of the gap, take up some of the slack left by King Charles, where his public duties are concerned. Tell me about that planning. Will that planning have been in place, in a drawer, ready for precisely such an eventuality, Professor?
Yes, it would. Can I just say at the beginning how sad I am to hear this news?
Indeed.
I'm the same age as King Charles. We were born in the same year. And so it's, I think, very sad to hear someone of his age having cancer. Let us hope that the treatment works and that he survives to reign for a long time to come. But there are arrangements in place. They're long-standing. They're set out in an Act of Parliament called the Regency Act of 1937. And that provides what happens in the situation where the monarch is either temporarily or more permanently incapacitated. And if it's temporary incapacitation, then deputies are appointed who are called councillors of state. And we saw an example of that in the last year or so of the Queen's reign, when she was beginning to suffer from mobility problems. And people may remember that the Queen's speech was delivered by King Charles, sitting on the throne in the House of Lords, supported by Prince William, and they had been appointed jointly as councillors of state to deliver the Queen's speech on her behalf. And that was because of temporary incapacity, in that she didn't want to be wheeled through the Houses of Parliament in a wheelchair to deliver the speech. If the incapacity is more permanent, then the Regency Act provides for the appointment of a regent. And what the Act says is, if the sovereign is, by reason of infirmity of mind or body, incapable of performing the royal functions, then a regent can be appointed. But that infirmity has to be certified formally by 3 out of 5 people. And those 5 people are Queen Camilla, and then a politician, the Speaker of the House of Commons, and then 3 very senior legal figures, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Chief Justice, and the Master of the Rolls. And 3 out of those 5 are required to certify that the monarch is incapable of performing the royal functions.
Yes. And
in that event, a regency is triggered, and Prince William would then become regent.
That's a really, really interesting insight, Professor Hazell, into the constitutional mechanics that kick in the event of a longer period of infirmity and the King being unable to fulfil his duties. James Hill and Kate McCann are here with me in our studio. James.
Yes, well, I think obviously the importance of the monarchy is always the question that the crown must survive, and that the discussion there about succession, it's important to remember that you have the frailty of the human body, but also the nature of the crown continues to go on. And I think perhaps the last events of the last 18 months have reminded us of the mortality of the Windsors in the royal family of them. And I think that, talking about the councillors of state, for instance, it's notable how 5 years ago you'd had people like, you had the late Queen, the late Prince Philip, you had Harry and Meghan too, of course, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. And really, perhaps the extent to which the royal family has shrunk in terms of the numbers of people who can take on those burdens. Obviously, in the discussion there, we were talking about how the public visits have been ruled out by the King as a result of this diagnosis, but he will be doing lots of his paperwork, which obviously the red boxes, which both him and the late Queen were both very diligent at. So there's a question of that burden being taken over. But I do think there's a longer-term issue, given we've obviously seen the discussions around the Princess of Wales' health as well, about the number of duties which are falling on an increasingly smaller number of people within the royal family.
I mean, when Professor Hazell, clearly, if and we hope it's not the case that the prince's incapacity, the King's incapacity, goes on for a longer period of time than it might, then we're talking about arrangements kicking in, possibly even some of those that you set out there. We don't know at this stage, and hope that turns out not to be the case. As it is, though, Professor, I suppose the duties that need to be performed by the monarch to keep the machinery of state ticking over, they are more limited in number, aren't they?
Well, a lot goes on behind the scenes. So the monarch formally has audiences with every incoming ambassador who comes to London and with every outgoing ambassador who goes to represent us in the rest of the world. The monarch has a weekly audience with the Prime Minister, has lots of meetings with senior officials, senior military people and the like. Not all those are obligatory, but they're certainly customary. And if the Prince of Wales does become regent, I would expect him to carry out those duties in a very similar way and just as conscientiously as the Queen famously did for her 70 years on the throne, yes. And as King Charles has been doing very conscientiously himself. And a regency can last for several years. And the last time we had a regent, the person known as the Prince Regent, who became King George IV, he was regent from memory, I think, for almost 10 years, from 1811 to 1820.
Yes. And before we come to the point of which when we're not at this point of having to contemplate the possibility of a regency, there are the duties the king must perform that we all know are part of his diary. Those regular audiences with the Prime Minister, for example, I forget whether they're one or two a week. But is that, Professor, something that Prince William, for example, could step in and take on instead?
Well, if he becomes regent, he effectively becomes the monarch in everything but name.
But short of that, if he's simply helping to take up the slack, would you expect the Prince, on a given day, if it's not appropriate for the King to meet the Prime Minister, could Prince William do that sort of more mundane task?
No, he certainly could. And it would make sense, if you like, as part of his apprenticeship as the monarch in waiting to begin to receive state papers and to attend some of these audiences. I have no inside knowledge, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of that has already started to happen as part of a very gradual handover. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says it's formally required for the monarch and only the monarch to have an audience with the Prime Minister. So Prince William could do that occasionally, or he could start to do it permanently without necessarily a regency having been declared. Mm. But if he were to become regent, then he would be monarch, acting monarch in every sense. And he wouldn't simply be deputizing informally. He would be deputizing very, very formally, and the regent has all the powers that a monarch already has.
It's really interesting, Professor Hazell. Kate McCann.
Professor, I just wondered, given that there is obviously another ongoing situation with Catherine at the moment and her own sort of health concerns, where do you think that leaves William in this conversation? Because we know that he has had to sort of scale back his own duties. We know that his focus will be obviously on his family. Do you think that will put an added pressure on this situation?
It would put added pressure, but from what we know of the example of the Queen and of King Charles, when it comes to the crunch, they've always put duty above their own personal circumstances. That is one of the obligations of monarchy. If you like, it's one of the burdens that they have to bear. So I have no doubt that Prince William, if required, will step up and will fulfill very conscientiously all the obligations of the monarchy.
Yes, and I mean, I imagine, tell me if you can throw any light on this, but I imagine pretty clearly that it is part of the upbringing of a senior royal to be ready for this sort of thing. There'll be almost a continual process of tutelage in what might be needed in the event of, your father being unavailable, that sort of thing. It goes with the territory, doesn't it, Professor?
Absolutely, yeah. And they will all have seen the example of the Queen, Prince William's grandmother, and how very, very loyally and conscientiously she carried out her duties. So I think that's an example, certainly, that King Charles, and he stated this publicly, he feels very strongly he's following in her footsteps, and she set the example that he follows, and that in turn I would expect Prince William to follow.
All right. Professor Robert Hazell, who's Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London. Thank you for joining us, Professor.